Well, thank you all very, very much for coming out in such numbers to what we sincerely hope, we being the University of Melbourne and in particular the School of Government and the Faculty of Law of the University, we very much hope that this is going to be a stimulating event, a thought-provoking event, a stimulating discussion. It will take the form, actually, of a discussion at a later stage, but before we get to that point, we thought the best way would be to introduce you to the topic through two keynote speeches, if you like, and also through a very short film which will visually give you a little bit of a sense of what the speakers will subsequently be talking about. But let me begin by acknowledging from the outset that this event is taking place on land traditionally owned by the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to their elders and family members, both past and present. I'm going to make a few introductory talking points, and then I will pass the floor over to our speakers. I want to begin by noting something which I'm sure is very self-evident to all of you, and that is that the asylum issue in Australia has taken on a high and very contentious profile over recent years. Irregular boat arrivals have in effect become the definition of the refugee problem for so many commentators here, not to mention practitioners, and the result is that, at least from our perspective, that the refugee and asylum issues are too often being discussed and solutions being sought in a somewhat, if I may put it this way, insular and provincial manner, bereft of much broader context where they rightfully belong. Australia's difficulties with boats do have a broader context, which many feel has not been given sufficient attention in the overheated debates which have been playing out over many months in the Parliament, in the press, in the media, and in civil society. This debate arguably has very badly served an Australian public struggling to understand what is this problem, really, what can be done about it, and what should be done about it. Now, with situations of violence and persecution proliferating, and we just need to look at the news, open the newspapers, we read about Somalia, Sudan, Iraq, Syria, the Ukraine, or even closer to home, Myanmar, and with old crises refusing to die and becoming intractable, and here we witness Afghanistan, Iraq, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and with natural disasters likely to displace many more people through environmental degradation, through climate change, through the slow onslaught effects of drought, desertification, shrinking agricultural land, etc. With solutions very elusive and money less available, it requires absolutely no leap of the imagination to see why there are so many refugees, so many asylum seekers on the move today. And then, according to the just released 2014 Human Development Report, there are 1.2 billion people who live on $1.25 or less a day. With high and persistent global inequality, disempowerment of large groups of people around the world, and a proliferation of transport options, it's also hardly surprising to see so many irregular migrants more generally. Now, boat departures have always been a safety valve for the persecuted and for the downtrodden. They're symptomatic of the much deeper malaise which variously afflicts the societies from which the boat people come and through which they pass. The root problem is this malaise. And Australia is but one of many other countries confronting a sizable flow of irregular migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees. And you'll hear about that in the coming presentations. So, as the situation in all of these countries, from Yemen to Italy to many other countries that are receiving boats and from which these boat people come, as the situation in these countries attests to, it is a challenge in a world of growing connectivity and human mobility to manage your borders and preserve national security. That's undeniable. But long-term solutions anywhere will remain elusive where they ignore what drives people to put themselves in such perilous circumstances on boats. Boats will continue until what drives these people to leave, the root causes of their departure, are addressed. Now, these movements are also but one feature, one actually relatively small feature of a global displacement situation of major and immediate concern around the world today. There are many millions currently displaced or fleeing as we speak. Why they're leaving their homes and their countries, where they're going to, how receiving countries and the United Nations are responding, and what works and what doesn't in this regard will be the subject of the first presentation we will shortly hear from the High Commissioner's Assistant High Commissioner for Operations, Janet Lim. Before I give the floor to Janet, however, it was felt that it would be useful to show you first a short film which has been made by UNHCR to set the context of what she will be talking about.
Ongoing insecurity, persecution, natural disasters, conflict and war. They are the nation of the displaced, driven from their homes. At the end of 2013, there were over 51.2 million people forcibly displaced, the highest number since World War II. If they were a country, it would be the 26th largest in the world. In 2013, each day, on average, every day, 32,200 people were forced to flee. Syria alone has hemorrhaged more than 3 million refugees in 3 years, the largest number from a single country. In Asia, they are 7.7 million, refugees, displaced, or stateless. Their ordeal can last years, even decades. Afghans in Pakistan and Iran, almost the largest single group of refugees in the world. People from Myanmar forced to flee to Bangladesh and Thailand. Bao Me escaped from her country with her husband and family. Desperation breeds desperate measures. Desert crossings, flight by boat, anything to escape. Abdullah fled sectarian violence in Myanmar, but was taken prisoner on a brutal smuggler's ship. He survived, then was in a detention center for 2 months, only to end up this time in a smuggler's camp. His family paid almost $2,000 for his release, but ill and discouraged, his future seemed bleak. Across the world, 50% of all refugees are children. Displacement often lasts a lifetime or more. Some children are second or third generation refugees. And many die in exile. The grave of Bao Me's husband is far from his land, his dream to return home unrealized. Millions of refugees in exile, but many millions more caught in conflict inside their countries. 33.3 million people are internally displaced. In North Waziristan, Pakistan, military operations displace thousands of families. In the Philippines, a disaster strikes, uprooting nearly 1 million people, leaving them with nothing. In Syria alone, civil strife has left 6.5 million internally displaced, almost a third of the country. Nepal, Thailand, and Malaysia accounted for the largest number of refugees leaving for resettlement in 2013, over 28,000. For all of Asia and the Pacific, that figure was more than 32,000. But compare that to the 1.1 million individual asylum applications registered with governments or UNHCR in 2013. That's the highest in a decade. Humanitarian agencies and actors face huge challenges: ethnic, sectarian, and economic. The tide of misery rises. Managing it must be a shared responsibility. UNHCR cannot stand alone. The task requires care, commitment, and leadership from everyone: governments, civil society, and the UN. Otherwise, the nation of the displaced and their despair will only grow.
Is now going to make her way to the podium, and as she does so, I want to say that we're very privileged to have here one of UNHCR's most experienced and senior staff members. As the Assistant High Commissioner for Operations, she holds one of the 4 top management positions in UNHCR. She now has a career which spans some 33 years with the organization. She joined UNHCR in 1980, and she has very prior to taking up this appointment, she got to know this region very well, not least she comes, of course, from this region, but she knows it very well because she had a very demanding 5-year assignment as Director of the Bureau for Asia and the Pacific. She's also served in a number of other capacities in UNHCR, both in Geneva and the field. She was, for example, the head of UNHCR's Emergency and Security Service, which, as you can imagine from the film you've just seen, is a very, very demanding responsibility. She was a coordinator in Western Sahara. She was the representative in Sri Lanka. And she served at the senior level on secondment to other United Nations organizations over the course of her career, including UN AIDS and UNAMA in Afghanistan. She has served as well with UNHCR in Malaysia, Thailand, and Syria. So with those words of introduction, Janet, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Erica. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure for me to be here with you today. I would like to begin by expressing deep appreciation to the University of Melbourne, in particular the Faculty of Law and the School of Government, which together have made possible the holding of this event. This event coincides with the signature of a Memorandum of Understanding between the University of Melbourne and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR. At UNHCR, we place a great deal of importance on strengthening our relationships with leading institutions of learning and research, of which Melbourne University clearly is one. We hope that this MOU will be the tool through which the collaboration between ourselves and the university will go from strength to strength in a number of areas of activity, enabling research and knowledge mobilization to be harnessed to the benefit of refugees and other persons of concern in Australia and globally. This MOU is also important because it brings us together. And a relationship like this, seeking fresh and innovative perspective and commitments for humanitarian action, is timely and necessary. Tonight, we will do the presentation in 2 parts. First, I would like to share with you some of the dramatic forced displacement trends. I will outline some of the challenges we face as UNHCR, but point out also the limits of what we can do and the important role of other actors beyond the United Nations. After that, my colleague, Ms. Daisy Dell, the director of our Bureau for Asia and Pacific, will elaborate on some specific situation in the Asia region to bring the issues closer to home. I come to Australia as the Assistant High Commissioner for Operations of UNHCR, which was created by the United Nations General Assembly to lead and coordinate international action for the worldwide protection of refugees and to find solutions. We work with governments, with other UN agencies and international organizations, with NGOs and with civil society towards these objectives. And this is the first in a series of events and meetings during our visit to Australia with those objectives in mind. As you have seen from the video, we are all confronted by what, in terms of numbers, could constitute a nation of the displaced. But the reality is, of course, that the displaced do not make up a nation. That is precisely what they have lost, a nation that can protect them. During my 33 years working for the United Nations, I've seen and worked in many crises and difficult situations, but not since UNHCR came into existence over 60 years ago have we been confronted by such a multiplicity of new emergencies. In the last 3 years, there has been a quantum leap in the number of major and simultaneous crises, their scale, and the sheer number of people forced to flee. It is hard not to see this as a new era of forced displacement, marked by an extremely challenging operational landscape. If we consider now some of the major crises that are the most current, such as Syria, the Central African Republic, South Sudan, and Iraq, their consequences have been dramatic and intense. Take Syria, where conflict began a short 3 years ago as an internal conflict in certain parts of the country. Today, it has metamorphosed into a large-scale, internationalized conflict. Conditions inside the country where conflict is raging have worsened to such an extent that people are arriving in neighboring countries in a shocking state, depleted physically, emotionally, and financially. Most have been on the run for a year or more, fleeing from village to village before taking the final decision to leave their country. Many have suffered unspeakable atrocities and losses of family and loved ones. With a population of 4 million, roughly the size of Melbourne City, Lebanon has received over 1 million Syrian refugees. Particularly dramatic is the fact that an entire generation of young Syrians is being shaped by violence, displacement, and a lack of education and opportunities. 2/3 of the refugee children and 3 million more children inside Syria are out of school. With every day the fighting continues, these children are at risk of losing their future altogether. That is why the United Nations launched a No Lost Generation campaign focusing on education, protection from abuse, and psychosocial care. This campaign has received strong international support, including a very welcome contribution of $20 million from Australia. Less in the world media, but equally dramatic, have been the consequences of the interreligious conflict in the Central African Republic, which has seen more than 500,000 people displaced inside this very small country and 400,000 fleeing into neighboring countries, leaving no part of the country untouched by the conflict. In South Sudan, the aspiration of a new country was short-lived, with a renewed outbreak of fighting and violence causing massive exodus within and outside the country, all in a matter of months. Added to the complexity is the presence of 243,000 refugees, mainly from neighboring Sudan, also endangered by the fighting. The return of South Sudanese from neighboring countries, facilitated by UNHCR, which should have been a classic success story of return home after a long period of exile, has been suspended. In fact, many of those who have returned have now had to flee from the recent violence, becoming refugees once again. Let me return to the Middle East and the rapidly unfolding crisis in Iraq. The rise of ISIS, or the Islamic State, which has been gaining territories in Iraq, has caused an overall estimated 1.2 million to be displaced internally in very dramatic circumstances. But even before this recent development, many Iraqis were already refugees in neighboring countries such as Syria and Jordan. Conversely, some 200,000 Syrians have sought asylum in Iraq. In short, we now have a number of situations where refugees may be refugees several times over as they seek asylum in countries that then become caught up in conflict themselves. We are witnessing desperate refugees fleeing to seek safety in countries where conflict is ongoing and from where other refugees are fleeing. The dramatic images of human suffering and loss that you must have seen in the media speak for themselves. Most recently, particularly worrying images are emerging of atrocities and human rights abuses, often with women and children or other civilians as targets. The impact of these major crises in the Middle East and Africa have also been felt far beyond these regions, as refugees move beyond neighboring countries to seek asylum further afield. Hence, in Europe, the United States, and elsewhere, the increased numbers of asylum applications has not surprised us. In the first half of 2014, the European Union countries saw an increase of 18% over the same period last year, with Germany receiving almost 12,000 new applications from Syrian asylum seekers and Sweden close to 10,000. The United States and Canada received 160 asylum applications from Syrians in the first month of 2014, and we have even seen a small trickle of Syrians arriving to Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Island states. Refugees are crossing deserts and seas to seek safety. In desperation, increasing numbers take sometimes perilous boat journeys, such as the 100,000 people, over half of whom are Syrians, Somalis, and Eritreans, who have crossed the Mediterranean Sea just this year. Nearly 2,000 have lost their lives doing so. As you can see, maritime movements are not a phenomenon unique to this part of the world. Due to the urgency of the need to respond to such movements, the High Commissioner will in December be hosting a global dialogue on the topic of protection at sea in Geneva. As new crises multiply, many old ones remain unresolved, or even worse, flare up again. Afghanistan is a case in point, as you will hear from Ms. Dale. In Somalia, while there has been improvement at the political level with the establishment of a government, insecurity nevertheless remains, and many parts of the country are inaccessible to humanitarian workers because of continued fighting by armed groups. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the presence of so many different armed groups with different affiliation has continued to wreak havoc and terror on the population in different parts of the East, even as some groups and areas have been neutralized. Although peacekeeping operations have been deployed to these countries, there is in fact no peace yet to keep. And some of those who have returned have had to flee again when faced with new outbreaks of violence. UNHCR's mandate for refugees means that we are engaged with refugees from the beginning to the end, and not only at the height of an emergency. Indeed, working with governments to find durable solutions remain the ultimate goal of UNHCR's work, and perhaps its biggest challenge. Currently, more than 2/3 of refugees under UNHCR's mandate, that is about 8 million persons, live in what we call protracted situations of exile. That means they have left their country of origin more than 5 years ago, though for many, it has actually been several decades. From Pakistan to Kenya, from Eastern Sudan to Bangladesh, and in many more places, there are tens of thousands of refugee children whose grandparents were the last to see their home country. Many of these protracted refugee situations were once in the limelight, like Syria and Iraq are today, but now they are hardly mentioned. They are invisible and they are neglected. But the needs continue. The lives of the refugee in these protracted situations are no less harrowing, as over time, their presence in their host countries and host communities become less welcome, and they have difficulties to establish lives of self-reliance and normalcy. Solutions for these refugees are elusive but clearly urgent. While we focus on refugees, I think we should recall that the single most important factor in ensuring the effective protection of refugees is the generosity of host countries and local communities. More than 85% of the world's refugees are hosted in developing countries. And without a doubt, the burden placed on host country has been very heavy. The major influx in 2011 of Ivorian refugees into Liberia, one of the world's poorest countries, just recovering from over a decade of war, is a good example. Thousands of Liberians shared their farmland, shelter, even food with refugees from Ivory Coast. A little over a decade earlier, many of these Liberians had themselves received the same hospitality from their impoverished Ivorian neighbors. There are many other examples in all continents of the world, and the cost of hosting refugees, of course, goes beyond economics alone. The social and political costs must not be underestimated. Thankfully, the major refugee outflow of recent times from Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, also neighboring countries, by and large, keeping their borders open. Their generosity must be commended, but cannot be taken for granted. The growth in absolute number of the forcibly displaced we are seeing is accompanied by the ever-increasing complexity of the environment surrounding forced displacement, including, as was mentioned before, by a number of interrelated and mutually reinforcing global trends such as population growth, urbanization, food and water scarcity, and climate change. Another challenging characteristic of the current era is that there are no longer clear-cut parties to the conflict. The Syria and Iraq situation are prime examples, with multiple groups and fighters from all over the world. Groups often fragment, change allegiances, and one can never be sure a group or coalition represent the interests they claim. At the same time, major powers in the world, those with the clout to influence and possibly bring about peace, are also not united. Hence, peace negotiations are more difficult than ever. A further complexity is the increased blurring of lines, which used to clearly separate civilian and military spheres in the action of the international community, and what should be the sacrosanct humanitarian principles of neutrality and impartiality are becoming more difficult to preserve in an era where humanitarian actions are easily politicized. There is an erosion of respect for international humanitarian law and human rights, with civilians increasingly being deliberately targeted, held captives as weapons of war, or used as human shields. Well over 80% of all casualties of war today are now civilians, the highest percentage on record. One of the biggest challenges we face in this deteriorating environment is to continue to deliver protection and assistance in remote, inaccessible, and insecure situations. Our staff and partners may not only find themselves caught in the crossfire, but being fired upon. 2013 saw a new record for violence against aid operations and staff. 155 aid workers were killed, 171 seriously wounded, and 134 kidnapped, an overall 66% increase in victims since 2012. Despite the generosity of host and donor states, humanitarian response and community reception capacities are overstretched. For its part, and although it already has a robust emergency response capacity, UNHCR has had to take many exceptional measures within the organization. These have included scaling up emergency stockpiles, both centrally and regionally, to be sufficient for more than 2 million people globally. In addition to our usual emergency response team, experienced staff throughout the organization are on 72-hour notice to deploy wherever there is need. Partner organizations have also increased their capacity to deploy at short notice. In this regard, we appreciate our long-standing standby partnership agreement with Red R Australia in support of emergency operations across the world. Perhaps the biggest challenge has been to fund our operations to maintain an effective response. The total expenditure of UNHCR has increased each year for the last 3 years and will probably exceed $3 billion by the end of this year. While this has been possible due to the increased contribution of donors, it nevertheless has fallen far short of assessed needs, which amount to $6 billion. If we take the Syria operation alone, the United Nations and its partners has called for contributions of $6 billion for 2014. This is the largest ever financial requirement for a single force displacement situation on record, and involves UNHCR working closely with over 100 different partner agencies and organizations. We are unable to say we have met the needs of all refugees and internally displaced persons. In fact, with the limited resources relative to needs, we have had to find new and imaginative ways to stretch the resources. For instance, we have developed tools to be able to identify and assist the most vulnerable. We have introduced more cost-effective ways of delivering assistance, such as through the use of cash and electronic vouchers, rather than do in-kind distributions, which has a lot of attendant costs and infrastructure. Out of necessity, actually, our operations in the Syria crisis have been the testing ground for many new initiatives. With the magnitude of financial needs, we are obliged to seek contributions from as many sources as possible, including from the private sector. Support from the private sector is growing steadily, from US $21.7 million in 2006 to $190 million in 2013, but we need for it to continue to increase. Our challenge is not only to maintain and increase funding for the high-profile operations such as Syria, but also for less publicized operations where the humanitarian needs are as dire. It is clear that given the dimension of displacement we are confronted with, humanitarian intervention is necessary, but not sufficient. The entire international system of refugee protection is built upon the notion of solidarity and the sharing of responsibilities. In a world which is increasingly interlinked, no country is immune from the effects of conflict, however far away. International solidarity must find expression in ensuring financial resources are made available to assist those in need and to alleviate the burden of the hosting states and communities. Responsibility sharing through the resettlement of refugees and the broadening of development programs to target host community are also key areas where donor countries can ensure action-based solidarity. From an institutional perspective, and particularly from my operations-focused perspective, we would of course be nowhere without the wide range of civil society organizations directly supporting and passionately advocating for the rights of those who have been forcibly displaced. Civil society actors, from academia to community leaders and organizations, contribute to the public discourse in an essential way, serving as a check to ensure that states and non-state actors look at the broader picture of forced displacement and protection to avoid simplistic or populist explanation for complex and multidimensional issues. For example, fears about projected floods of refugees in industrialized countries are often exaggerated and mistakenly conflated with issues of migration. Those fears can all too easily manifest into statements and acts of xenophobia against foreigners, be they refugees, migrants, or others. Ladies and gentlemen, in a world where displacement is becoming increasingly large-scale and complex, no matter how much we can and do respond to humanitarian emergencies, our focus needs to shift much more forcefully towards addressing the root causes of conflict, conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and peace building, so that refugees are not forced to flee in the first place. This is not possible without political will and action on the part of states. We have appreciated the constructive role Australia has recently played on the United Nations Security Council, including in relation to Syria. While long-term solutions are sought, we must maintain our collective commitment to providing essential assistance to those who are affected by conflict and serious human rights violation. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you for managing to overcome what has been a difficulty for Janet since she arrived here in Australia, and that's a very raspy throat. So I think she did a magnificent job under the circumstances. What you did show very much, I think, is how dire is the international situation today and how much the situation in Australia is a byproduct of that situation and of nothing less. I think Janet's talk has very much helped us to understand why the high percentage of asylum seekers who come to Australia are actually recognised as refugees. This is a statistic I think we have to keep in mind as we listen to the various presentations tonight. It's not surprising, of course, that so many people are recognised as refugees here, regardless of how they come, because of the serious instability that Janet described in many parts of the world and the lack of any reasonable protection space between the countries from which refugees are fleeing and the countries in which refugees can find meaningful protection. There are very few signatories to the Refugee Convention between Afghanistan and Australia, for example. Janet talked about issues of humanitarian access and how difficult it was for the humanitarians actually to get out there and do what they're mandated to do. And she talked about the shrinking protection space for refugees when they do find a measure of asylum in the countries they arrive. Now, in a number of countries in Asia, these issues of humanitarian access and shrinking protection space remain serious concerns, from Afghanistan to Myanmar, and Daisy will talk about that very shortly. We read in the paper regularly about incidents of refoulement, that is, turning refugees back to situations of serious instability and great danger to them. We read a lot about turnarounds, about deportations, etc. And there are signs in many countries of closing asylum options, with refugee policies in states being very heavily contoured by security concerns and bilateral considerations towards neighbours. The grant of asylum is still seen by some as an unfriendly and hostile act, and refugee status determination by UNHCR is questioned on grounds that it challenges national sovereignty. This is what one sees in many parts of the world, including in this part. It doesn't assist also that, particularly in the Asia region, there is a lack of any consistent legal framework, and it makes it unclear as to what refugee rights are, what claims they are entitled to make, make and what obligations countries have to them. And this is unfortunately the more so because many of the countries in this region have become important transit countries for onward secondary movement. Very few of them have signed the 1951 Convention, and UNHCR remains de facto the system to which asylum seekers en route are required to have access if they're enabled to have access. Of the 15 biggest refugee status determination operations globally for UNHCR, 5 are in the Asia region. And now this brings me to the second speaker of the evening, Daisy Dell, who is the director of the Bureau for Asia and the Pacific. Daisy is also a very, very experienced UNHCR colleague. She was appointed director of the Regional Bureau in 2013, following 4 years as the director of UNHCR's Division of External Relations. She started her career with UNHCR in 1988 with the Division of International Protection. Daisy is a lawyer by background. She was a solicitor in the Palais de Justice in Luxembourg before she joined UNHCR. And since joining UNHCR, apart from her most recent position, she's held key positions both at headquarters in the field, including in Côte d'Ivoire and in Nepal. So with those words of introduction, Daisy, please.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before I turn to my part of the presentation, I would like to share with you the experience of today. I've been working for UNHCR for a long time, but this is my very first trip ever to Australia. And as you can imagine, we're reading a lot about Australia, we're hearing a lot about Australia. There's a lot of discussions about Australia. We meet some high government officials who want to explain to us what is happening in Australia. So I've come here with some ideas of what we have come to do and what we're going to try to say to government officials over the next few days. But we had the privilege today of going to Dandenong with AIMS and actually see for ourselves a refugee community, the staff of AIMS, what they're doing for this refugee community, refugee guides, community guides who are helping newly arrived refugees to integrate in Australia. We've seen refugees who've really made it, who have found their jobs, who are working well, who have integrated well into the community. And I was telling my colleagues as we were coming back, this is the best I've ever seen in all those years I've worked for UNHCR in terms of actually helping people to rebuild their lives in a new community and being able to give their kids a better future. I want to say that to start off with because obviously I'm going to say some things that you may like a little bit less. As Ms. Lim has given you, I believe, a fairly good comprehensive overview of the world, I'm going to turn to this region, Asia-Pacific, which in UNHCR is the region coming from Iran all the way down to Australia. The 45 countries and territories in this region are host to around a quarter of the global refugee population. As we saw in the video, that's about 7 million refugees, people in a refugee-like situation, persons displaced within their countries, returnees, and stateless persons. The two main refugee-producing countries in this region remain Afghanistan and Myanmar, or Burma, as you call it here. So let me start off by saying a few words about the Afghanistan situation. As you know, the war has displaced Afghans from their homes and from their country for over 3 decades. And Afghanistan remains today the largest protracted refugee situation in the world. To put this into context, it means that globally, nearly 1 in every 4 refugees today is an Afghan refugee. Now, up to 96% of all Afghans who have been forced to flee their country are actually living in the 2 neighboring countries, in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan and Iran, who have generously hosted these populations for over 3 decades. And Pakistan is still hosting the highest number of refugees in the world today. On the positive side, following the ousting of the Taliban regime, almost 6 million Afghan refugees have been able to return home with the help of UNHCR's voluntary repatriation program since the early 2000s. However, Afghanistan is currently in the middle of a very complex transition process with a very high level of uncertainty as regards the future leadership of the country. Hopes for a peaceful handover of the power by the Karzai government to a democratically elected president have still not materialized. The formation of a national unity government still remains an elusive aspiration. Moreover, with the announced pullout of the international troops by the end of this year, security incidents are on the rise as the Taliban are attempting to strengthen their power base. Return programs have slowed down to a trickle, and about 2.6 million Afghans still remain outside their country as registered refugees, and many more as not registered refugees. Many still want to return, but what does the future hold for this population? Foreign investment in the country is very much on hold, and development projects are difficult to implement. People face severe difficulties in finding jobs or livelihood opportunities in this rather unstable economic, political, and security environment. The movement of Afghans regionally remains exponential, with Afghans being the #1 nationality claiming asylum globally in 2013. As you well know, Afghans continue to move as far as Europe and Australia to seek safety. Therefore, it remains critical for the international community to step up its engagement with more support to address the humanitarian dimension and strengthen the search for long-term solutions for the people of Afghanistan. It's not only in the spirit of international solidarity and burden sharing, but also as a joint investment in stability and security within a sub-region and beyond. For our part, through dialogue with the 3 countries of the region, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran, and with the strong support of a number of donor governments, UNHCR has led the development and the international endorsement of a solution strategy for Afghan refugees in 2012. The main focus of the successful implementation of the strategy is to address the needs of returning Afghans to ensure that they are able to sustainably reintegrate into their communities and rebuild their lives in Afghanistan. A few months ago, I had the chance to visit an Afghan settlement in Haripur, Pakistan. This refugee camp developed over decades into a village with its own services, including its own schools. And I had the opportunity to discuss with a group of about 20 teenage girls who were all born in Pakistan as children of refugees, and I asked, and only one had ever visited Afghanistan. They all had dreams of their families going back to Afghanistan, but their biggest fear was that they would have to live under the Taliban regime and would no longer be allowed to attend schools. While waiting for the possibility to return home, they asked us to help them to continue their education in Pakistan, where Afghan schools and the camps only have classes up to grade 8, and where without a Pakistani identity card, they're not allowed to access public education in Pakistan. So under the solution strategy, one of our key priorities is indeed to empower young people through education and skills training, for example, by constructing classrooms, providing school uniforms, school supplies, and textbooks in Pakistan and Afghanistan to actually be able to follow up on their education. Access to education and vocational training will help them to rebuild their lives, whether they will stay in Pakistan or Iran, or whether they will be able to go back home. Let me now turn to the situation in Myanmar, which is another country in this region from where many persons from different ethnic groups have been fleeing over the past decades to find protection from ethnic conflict and violence. Currently, there are some 500,000 refugees from Myanmar in neighboring countries in the region. This includes Karen, Karenni, Chin in the border camps in Thailand, Rohingyas in Bangladesh, as well as large urban populations in New Delhi, Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, and many other cities in the region. Myanmar's Rohingyas make up the majority of those who are risking their lives to cross the sea in the search of safety. For many, the situation inside Myanmar is so desperate that they do not see any other solution than to undertake the risky journey by boat, and increasingly they do so with their families, often with small children. The intercommunal violence 2 years ago forced over 100,000 persons from their home. Many of them are with undetermined citizenship and not considered to be lawfully staying in Myanmar, even though their families have been living there since before independence in 1948. During several visits to Myanmar, including with Ms. Feller, and more recently with Ms. Lim, we have personally witnessed the desperate situation of the internally displaced persons who live in temporary camps, and we can testify to the immense humanitarian needs in this country, in particular in Rakhine State. During the first half of this year alone, we estimate that about 20,000 people would have left by sea and arrived in the region suffering from malnutrition and having survived abuse during the journey. Our staff have interviewed many of the survivors, and this has offered insights into the suffering during the long and arduous journey from Myanmar and Bangladesh to Thailand, Malaysia, and beyond. As we saw in the video, there are reports of death due to illness, heat, lack of food, water, and severe beatings. Upon the arrival in Thailand, the survivors of the sea journey have told us that of the smugglers of being taken to smuggler camps in and around hills, jungles, and plantations. And many were actually unaware that they would be asked to pay more money to smugglers during the journey to be released upon arrival. So they pay very little when they leave, but actually once they're on the boats, they're asked to pay a lot more. They're asked to call their relatives in Myanmar, in Bangladesh, in Malaysia to send more money through hard currency bank transfers or mobile payment systems. Those who couldn't pay would be beaten and detained for long, long periods of time. Survivors of this ordeal also told our staff about people dying in the smugglers' camps due to illness and physical injuries. Now, as I said earlier, all these developments take place and continue to take place in the context of a very challenging protection environment for refugees in this region. But the answer to irregular movements is not to tighten our borders or to close our doors to people who most need our help and protection. We need a change of approach. We need collective engagement. The international responsibility sharing is the basis on which the whole global refugee system works. Experience has shown that no one country alone, or even bilaterally, can tackle the breadth of such a complex, multi-layered problem. So we in UNHCR encourage governments to join together to ensure that people are not forced to risk their lives repeatedly on dangerous and arduous journeys in search of safety, whether by sea or by land, and if they are, that they are not met with closed doors, or worse still, fatal consequences after fleeing violence in their country. Indeed, collective engagement needs the commitment of countries of origin, of the receiving countries, as well as the countries in transit. With this in mind, UNHCR in 2010 developed and proposed to states in the Asia-Pacific a regional cooperation framework that provides practical arrangements for responding to and effectively managing refugee and irregular movements in this region. The framework assists participating states to develop predictable responses and to pool support amongst them for dealing with these mixed movements. It covers a range of aspects, including processing and case management of individual asylum seekers, as well as regional support for third country resettlement and otherwise the sharing of responsibilities. And it is encouraging that this approach has been welcomed by states in the region. UNHCR continues to work closely with states so that these irregular movements are effectively managed regionally and in a comprehensive, cooperative way to ensure that people needing help and protection are identified and assisted. This is indeed what UNHCR envisaged when developing the regional cooperation framework. And to this end, the 45 member states of the Bali process have created a regional support office based in Bangkok for states to operationalize this framework. There are several activities that UNHCR has been spearheading under the auspices of this office. There's one in particular that I would like to highlight, which is related to our work in addressing irregular maritime movements. As I mentioned earlier, people have not stopped departing irregularly from Myanmar and Bangladesh on boats. In fact, the number grows. Moreover, people have similarly been on the move from South Asia and Indonesia to Australia and across the Strait of Malacca from Malaysia to Indonesia. The way states deal with these boats has often varied from, on one hand, not allowing them to disembark but helping them on to continue their journeys, or allowing boats to dock and disembark people but then placing them in immigration detention, or on the other hand, to intercept boats before reaching their intended destination and transferring the passengers elsewhere. All the while, these people are further subject to exploitation and trauma and even death. To counter such risks, UNHCR has been working with states to map disembarkation options and then agree on a harmonized and shared response for receiving people arriving onto territorial shores that ensures for their humanitarian and protection needs in a safe and predictable way. Solutions of the past may have to be revisited and adapted to the realities of today. Rescue at sea and resettlement of the Indo-Chinese from Southeast Asian countries to Australia and other Western countries saved many lives in the 80s. However, expectations of Southeast Asian countries that this is the only way of solving refugee problems in this region are no longer realistic. All countries in the region need to step up to their responsibilities to provide protection to refugees and accept to look for solutions for these populations in their own territories, either through providing temporary protection where that is appropriate or regularizing the legal status and providing work rights. Governments in the region understandably face many challenges in addressing irregular boat arrivals in a way that saves lives and also meets the concerns of national security and migration management, as well as international standards and protection needs of asylum seekers and refugees. However, in continuing to promote options, as I've just described, UNHCR hopes that states will be persuaded that indeed we are dealing with a regional phenomenon that, if not solved regionally, will continue to end tragically for more desperate people on the move. The Bali process and the follow-up of the Jakarta conference last year have shown a commitment to this sort of collective protection-sensitive engagement. We urge that the complementary processes need to move ahead in that direction without turning back. Too many lives are at stake for any one state to do it alone. In conclusion, let us remember that international responsibility sharing is the basis on which the whole global refugee system works. The numbers may seem daunting and the challenge near impossible for you or for us to take on. But as the video showed, there's a person behind every number. From Abdullah, the father from Rakhine State, who risks his life for his family's future, to Barmi, the grandmother from the camp in Thailand, yearning to return home and be buried back in Myanmar. We must not accept that refugees could die in their search for safety, that they could fail to find meaningful protection, and that generations could languish in exile with no hope of a future. This responsibility lies not just with states and the UN, but with all of us as citizens of the world. We have a moral imperative to provide the care, the commitment, and the leadership needed to find solutions for this growing nation of the displaced. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Daisy. I think as Daisy's presentation showed, the problems in this region are no less few and no less difficult than they are in other parts of the world. Daisy made a strong plea, I think, for international solidarity and burden sharing, and for states to take an enlightened approach as opposed to focusing too much on restrictions when it comes to people arriving on their territory and making a claim to their protection and assistance. Daisy, I think, indicated also how well Australia has done in terms of its settlement programs here. I think it's also worth bearing in mind that Australia has been taken quite a leading role when it comes to decisions in the Bali process, which Daisy mentioned, to adopt a regional cooperation framework and to create a regional support office to underpin it. It was, in fact, a decision taken at a Bali process meeting, which was very, very largely spearheaded by the then Australian Foreign Minister, Mr. Kevin Rudd, that decision is actually led to the Bali process agreeing to a regional cooperation framework and the creation of this support office. So I think one of the things Daisy very strongly made the point was that this momentum that was created not least by Australia's contribution needs now to be kept up and not left to somehow meander and disappear at this point. Australia is actually quite well situated to make a meaningful contribution to protection in this region. It was one of the earliest signatories to the 1951 Refugee Convention, and it was actually Australia's accession to that convention which brought that convention into effect. Australia is also a very generous donor to UNHCR, both through official and private sector contributions. It's one of the big three resettlement countries with excellent standards, as Daisy mentioned, of settlement services. And of course, it's a prosperous country, having very small numbers in the scheme of things to manage. So it is actually well positioned to play a meaningful role in keeping asylum alive and a proper response in a region where the challenges are very many. We've now come to the interactive part of our discussion, and those who would like to take the floor, please indicate by showing your hand and stating your question. Please keep, to the extent possible, your contributions to questions rather than comment. And I have to also acknowledge that we have on the podium a third person, just to demonstrate not least that UNHCR does have men amongst its ranks. We have on the podium with us tonight is Thomas Albrecht. Thomas is the regional representative of UNHCR in Canberra, and he has coverage in his position for 16 Pacific countries as well as for Australia and of course New Zealand as well. He took up this assignment in 2014, and prior to that he served in many other countries like most UNHCR staff, including very recently as head of UNHCR's regional support hub in Nairobi. He has served as well in Washington and in Ghana, and he's worked in refugee situations in the East and the Horn of Africa, Southern Africa, West Africa, etc. So again, he's a very experienced UNHCR staff member, and I'm sure he will be more than happy to help Janet and Daisy out in the event that the questions get very local and very Australia-linked. So with that introduction, I open the floor now to any of you who would like to ask questions. It would help if you would say who you are and then perhaps address to one or other of the speakers. So, please, I'll take the question there first.
Hello, thank you to the panel. Rebecca Eckard from the Refugee Council of Australia. My question follows on from your talk about the regional cooperation framework that Australia was so pivotal in developing. Given that Australia's government that's now been in office for just under a year, their only commentary on regional cooperation is that it will now be a regional deterrence framework. Just wonder if you could give us an understanding of how UNHCR plans to work with a government that is posing the situation in those terms. Thank you.
We might take perhaps a question from your neighbour as well at the same time, and maybe we can group a couple of the questions.
Derek McDougall, University of Melbourne. There's been no mention of the Palestinian refugees. I realise they come under a separate agency, but they are part of this global issue, and I wonder what responsibilities UNHCR has in relation to the Palestinian refugees, and do you think having a separate agency actually obscures the plight of these people? I understand the Palestinians are actually the biggest single group of refugees.
Thank you. Do we have a third question to add to that before we revert to the panel? Does anybody want to take the floor now, or should we? Okay, maybe we'll start with the questions. I guess that's for you, Daisy, the question about regional cooperation and deterrence.
I hadn't heard that expression, but I have seen that indeed there has been a change, and it has been a more difficult period actually to move forward. But at the same time, we have seen that there has been an engagement of Australia to continue working with this. The challenge was, and you may well know that, was that the two co-chairs of this and who actually sort of run the regional support office is Australia and Indonesia. And as the relationship between Australia and Indonesia was not very good for a while, and I think you know more about this than I can tell you, it was difficult to work through the regional framework and the regional support office. But I think we have overcome that right now. There's been a couple of other conferences. This Jakarta conference was happening in parallel, and I think we've overcome that. And there is a willingness at the working level, quite clearly, to move forward and look at how we can do this regional burden sharing. Because I think, as I've said in my presentation, it's not one country alone that can do this. There has to be a shift in the region. Also, countries that have been used to just receiving refugees and resettling them onto Western countries and Australia need to change. And these discussions are ongoing now. So we do believe very much that the regional framework is the way forward, and most countries in the region seem to believe that as well.
I think, Daisy, also on the question of deterrence, if I may be so bold as to offer a comment, that when you listen to both the speakers and you see why people are leaving their countries, and you see the circumstances in the countries of asylum as the first asylum countries that are hosting them, you realize that deterrence has a huge uphill battle if it is going to be the sole basis on which policies are crafted. You'll never deter people from leaving for as long as the push factors are much stronger, and they're clearly very strong from these presentations. So I think that UNHCR has always taken the position that deterrence will not work. It's morally perhaps not the most responsible policy. It's legally full of difficulties, but practically its likelihood of achieving the goal of stopping the boats is very, very small in today's age. Janet, do you want to take the one on Palestinians?
I will, yes. Well, indeed, I think the issue of the Palestinian refugees is very, very relevant in the current context of all these proliferating conflict. I mean, after all, you know, the unresolved situation of the Palestinians have been the cradle from which many other crises have been born as well. UNHCR does not have direct responsibility for the Palestinian refugees in the areas that are hosting, that are in the immediate countries by resolution of the General Assembly, but we do work very, very closely with UNRWA. And so we do coordinate very well. And for Palestinians who go outside the region, they are treated by UNHCR as any other refugees. The numbers are, of course, huge. And when I talked about, you know, how difficult the situations are for refugees who are fleeing from conflict to conflict, I think the Palestinian refugees probably have the worst of this experience. You know, when conflict broke out inside Syria, they were caught in a situations where they were not able to move. The countries were not willing to accept them. And we have Palestinian refugees in Iraq, in Syria, in Jordan, and they still are there. But we are working very, very closely with UNRWA. I think that, you know, it will not be possible to try now to merge the work of UNHCR with UNRWA. It would just be too huge. But what is important is that we maintain very close cooperation with each other.
One of the things that UNHCR does regularly, I think, Janet, with UNRWA is it has consultations on an annual basis. And these consultations are designed to produce greater coordination and cooperation between the policies and programs of UNRWA and the policies and programs of UNHCR. And UNRWA has traditionally defined itself not as a protection agency, but as an assistance agency, but increasingly it has a growing protection arm. And it is now looking also at its own mandate in the context of a broader outreach to refugees. So there's a growing complementarity. And then, as Janet said, of course, UNHCR deals with a lot of Palestinians who are outside the operational area of UNRWA. And UNHCR has a standing legal instruction to all of its officers about when a Palestinian is of the responsibility of UNHCR and when not. So there may seem to be strict divisions between the various organizations, but actually there's quite a lot of coordination and cooperation. Yes, John.
It's John Langmore. I'm from the Melbourne School of Government. You talked about burden sharing, but you haven't given a a quantitative estimate of what of the number of refugees that Australia should take if it was to be a fair participant in burden sharing. What kind of factors would you take into account in judging whether a country was fulfilling its responsibility for burden sharing, and what number of refugees do you think Australia ought to be taking, or even a range? Can you suggest a range that would be a responsible number?
That's a very good question, a very loaded question. I don't know, Daisy or Thomas or both, if you want to comment on that.
I'm not sure there is an answer to this. I mean, I don't think any of the four of us would have that answer. I think what we are saying in our discussions is basically saying when people come to Australia to find protection in Australia, they should not be moved somewhere else. And so those people who come here, who make it to Australia, Australia has the responsibility under the 51 Convention to actually provide protection to and solutions to these people. The deterrence factor right now makes it very difficult to say, sort of how many people should really be coming here. But it's true in discussions, when we have those discussions in Geneva, we give the numbers that Janet has put here, and we say, Lebanon is obviously the worst right now because one in five is a refugee, I think, but many others in the region as well have the same problems. And Europe, in many ways, is starting to have the same problem. So I don't think there's an answer. Janet and Erica may have different views on that, on how many they should take. But when you look at the country, the size of the country, the size of the population, and the numbers we're talking about, 20,000 that has gone down to 13,000 now who could come as refugees to Australia, it does indeed seem to be a very small number. I've said that to representatives from Australia in Geneva. I said, I come from Luxembourg. It's a landlocked country, so people don't come by boat, but they do come. It's a tiny country in the middle of Europe. We have 42% foreigners living there and more coming to work for the day. The city of Luxembourg has 60% of foreigners living there, and it doesn't seem to undermine my Luxembourg identity. So I think it's very difficult for us to discuss that with Australia because it seems to be such a different dimension.
Maybe if I can just add, I think it's all a question of putting it in perspective. When you look at Australia, the size of the country, the potential of the country, relative to what I have been trying to say in my speech, the overburden in these poor countries that are now taking care of 85% of the world's refugee. I think we just need to have a bit of a balance. Also, I think that a country like Australia can provide the potential to use refugees also in their own interest. This is a country that needs additional labor force, in my view, as many of the industrialized countries do. So we should not only just look at refugees as necessarily only being a burden to the countries that accepts them, but also the contribution they can make to the countries that receives them. Of course, the poor countries, because they are less developed, has less of that kind of potential than a well-developed country like Australia.
So are there? Yes, at the back. No. Yes. Sorry. I can't. My glasses are one problem. And the other problem is the lights shining in my eyes. So.
Hi, Yvette Crafty, Asylum Seeker Resource Centre and Red Hour Australia, thank you. I'm very interested in mixed migration flows and particularly how UNHCR is adapting, given, as has been known over the last few years, there is less and less of the so-called pure refugee and more emphasis on mixed migration flows. What kind of support or adaptation there is from UNHCR to assist industrialised nations and any nation receiving refugees, asylum seekers, to be able to process and understand, given that when I was working in Nyarugusu refugee camp in Tanzania with Congolese populations and the World Cup was on in 2010, There were satellite dishes. People had brought in all kinds of material to be able to, watch what was happening out there in the world. People are globalised now. They know what's out there. People move for lots of reasons, and I'm very interested to know what UNHCR is doing to adapt to this phenomenon.
So,
That's another one.
please, we'll take David.
Thank you, and thanks for the presentations. David Mann from the Refugee and Immigration Legal Centre, excuse my voice. The question relates to the UN Refugees Convention, which of course is the first and the fundamental legally binding instrument for the protection of refugees, and yet in our region, in this region, very few countries, as you referred to, have signed it. And my question is really, if you could comment please on both the importance of developing legal frameworks and also the promotion of the rule of law in the protection of refugees.
Thank you. Well, in a way, those two questions are strangely linked, because one of them deals with how you manage to distinguish between refugees on the one hand and migrants on the other, and what sort of systems are there to be put in place, and how is UNHCR broadly adapting to the fact of mixed migratory flows which contain asylum seekers and refugees, but also people moving for other reasons. Who are these people? How do you differentiate, and what is being proposed? And then David, of course, is asking about the weight that the organisation places on the rule of law, use of legal frameworks, development of legal frameworks. Maybe, Daisy, you would like to begin on that?
I feel cornered here because Ms. Fowler was the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, and these are questions she would normally answer. Anyhow, I will try my best, and I will invite her to comment on my answer. I think, indeed, the mixed migration is probably one of the biggest challenges we're having in Southeast Asia right now, because traditionally what we have been playing as a role is UNHCR will do the refugee status registration, refugee status determination in all these countries that don't have a legal framework and that haven't signed the 1951 convention. So when it's individual asylum applications, we in UNHCR have to do the whole processing of that. Or refugees find themselves in camps and are determined to be prima facie refugees, but then we don't go through those procedures. It is obvious that we are not in a position to continue doing that because the numbers are high and we are not in a position to find solutions for all of these people. We talked about resettlement. Third country resettlement is a great solution, but it applies to roughly 100,000 people a year. When you compare that to the figures we've seen here, it is nothing. I mean, we can say people should queue and wait to be resettled, but it will be second, third generation that will benefit from resettlement. So to go through the whole process of registration, status determination, and then put people in the queue and deal with all the fraud issues and all the issues that come up in that, is just no longer sustainable. We have started engaging with governments in the region now and basically say, you are hosting these people, you are a sovereign state, and we need to work together on solutions. That's why I made the reference to the CPA, the Comprehensive Plan of Action. It was basically states in the region hosted people on the understanding that Australia, New Zealand, and Western countries in Europe and North America would take them. And that has stayed, that mindset has stayed, and it's no longer possible to continue that way. So we are talking to states and saying, it cannot continue. We've also been talking to states, and I've done missions with Ms. Fana, with Ms. Lim, where we have raised that with Malaysia, with Indonesia, with Thailand, to basically say, look, you have a number of these people. They work here illegally. In Malaysia, there's over 150,000 people in a refugee-like situation, some of whom are registered, some of whom have had their status determined, most of whom work. You need 250,000 migrant workers, and you're reaching out to countries in the region to get those. Why don't you start looking at this? And so I think rather than going with individual status determination, as we've been doing for years, we may need to look at much more creative solutions where some of these people who are there and who are working and engaged in work get their labor rights confirmed and can work, that others maybe get temporary protection, can stay for a while and will go back. And we're looking in particular at the Myanmar refugees right now because some may be able to go back, some not. and that we actually deal in terms of with the protection through refugee status determination only with the most vulnerable people, those that find themselves in detention, that are at risk of refoulement. We have had a lot of discussions with countries in the region to have their own legal frameworks, even if they haven't signed the convention, because they will all tell us, you know, why we haven't signed the convention, but we do host refugees generously since so many years. And we're actually trying to push them to take on those responsibilities. Now, some have actually adopted refugee legislation and are starting to do status determination. Others have legislation and are still not doing it. So it is a very mixed bag. But I think the message is going to be quite clearly that we have to start changing this.
Thank you, Daisy. I think just a footnote to what you said, because Daisy mentioned earlier the Bali process and the regional cooperation framework. The regional cooperation framework had 3 early goals which were set for it by UNHCR and were adopted essentially by the states members of the Bali process. The first, and this goes directly to David Mann's question, the first was that the regional cooperation would assist in the development of functioning asylum systems based on the rule of law, based on systems which are accessible to asylum seekers regardless of mode of arrival, etc., in all the countries in the region. So having national functioning asylum systems and not having to rely on UNHCR, which is under-resourced and overburdened, was a key one of the 3 goals of regional cooperation. The second of the goals for regional cooperation was setting in place a burden-sharing mechanism in relation to solutions, which might be resettlement, but not only resettlement. To go to John's question about when is the right number, burden sharing is also to be understood in terms of local integration in countries which are receiving asylum seekers in the first instance. It's also to be understood in other forms of sharing of financial costs and sharing of costs associated with returning people who have come in a mixed migration movement, have made an unsuccessful asylum claim, and will be going back to their countries of origin. So burden sharing has a sort of multiple notions attached to it. But rule of law and the establishment of rule of law through the creation of functioning, accessible, and fair asylum systems has been one of the fundamental pivots of regional coordination. But as Daisy said, of course, you know, there are other ways to address some of these problems as well. And going to the question about migration, UNHCR has for some time now toyed with the dangerous idea that migration might be a 4th solution to complement the solutions of local settlement, resettlement, and voluntary repatriation. So looking at a temporary migration arrangement as a form of 4th solution is something that UNHCR has actually been discussing, and I guess still is. Are there any? Yes. Yes.
I'm Johan Kaur from the Transcultural Mental Health Unit at St Vincent's Hospital, and also I do sessional work at Foundation House, which is a place that an NGO that looks after survivors of torture. I'd like to raise the issue of the change of government policy that blocks the family repatriation of illegal boat arrivals or illegal maritime arrivals, as it's called. This, I think, is generally regarded by most people as a very, very ill-devised or poorly planned sort of policy change, and it's causing considerable mental health strain on the refugees who've already accepted. A few of our refugees have families are living within 30 kilometers of the front line of battle. I was just wondering whether UNHCR has any plans, sort of official and unofficial, to lean on the government to use their, not inconsiderable persuasive powers. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, who would like to take that question?
Thank you for this pertinent question. We not only have plans, we actually have already discussed and are discussing these very pertinent issues with the government and also with other partners in the civil society and other specialists who need to look at psychosocial needs. And I would like to just emphasize there are a couple of components. On one end, clearly a legal issue, the right to family unity and the imperative of family unity through family reunification in these circumstances. But I think we also have to see how, of course, in a refugee situation, what is a normal human right to family unity looks often very different. We also have components, as you, I think, hinted in your question in a way, components of other family members being still exposed to danger, to persecution. This is not only a question then how to rescue those family members and bring them to safety, but this is of course something that very seriously bears on the person who is in safety, who probably is worried day in, day out, who has a bad conscience about having left behind loved ones who need this and deserve protection. It's also a question of integration. As long as a refugee, even if he is recognized, even if he has basic opportunities for integration and settlement in a conducive environment otherwise, as long as you worry about your spouse, your children, and others, you will have great difficulties to really focus on settling down. So I think it is also an imperative from an integration perspective, because the quicker the refugee settles, and as we could see today, and as Daisy emphasized, the quicker that person becomes a contributing member. Not a burden, but a contribution, a great contribution in many instances, as we all know. And I think that is in need to be accompanied through family unity.
Thank you, Thomas. I think one of the great advantages of no longer being UNHCR is I can say things which probably I wouldn't have said if I was sitting there. And one of the things I want to say is that UNHCR for quite a long time has had discussions with the government about the concept of first-class refugee and second-class refugee, and has said that mode of arrival is actually an irrelevant consideration if the person's claim to refugee status is a valid claim and is recognized as such. And therefore, to make mode of arrival a reason to treat somebody in a second-class way as opposed to a first-class way doesn't have any proper legal underpinning, and it certainly has all the disadvantages and considerations at stake which Thomas has just mentioned. And it is a fact that family reunification is something which normally attributes to first-class refugees, but not second-class refugees here. So just to say that in addition to all of the things that Thomas mentioned, there's quite a serious legal issue here, which has been the subject and continues to be the subject of a lot of discussion, I think, with the government. I think we're coming to the end, actually, of the question and answer phase. So unless there are any last burning questions from anyone. Oh dear, I've provoked it. Georgie, how much? Georgie is our master, behind the scenes master of ceremonies, and I want to take this opportunity to thank her very, very strongly for all the hard work she's put into making this run like clockwork, as it has done. So thank you. So, how many questions can we take, if any? 2 or 3. Okay, well, I saw 3 hands. Let's take them. 1, 2, and where was the third one? 3. Okay. First one, front row, then third row, and then back there.
Thanks. Thank you, Erika. My name is Ramesh Kumar. I'm from AIMS here in Melbourne, and my question is to Daisy. She touched briefly the role of civil society, and the cooperation, global cooperation for this issue. And in terms of your work, Daisy, and anybody else on the podium, all the luminaries, where have you seen the best examples of civil society working on this issue, either to complement or counteract government actions?
Thank you. I think we'll take the questions all together and then we can refer them all 3 to the podium.
Thank you, Erika. My name is Ken Chan. I work with the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre in Melbourne. But I also have some experience and background on refugee tribunal issues. So I just want to pose a question about the definition and the 1951 Convention. I know there's been in the literature a fair bit of debate about whether the Convention has perhaps become a bit outmoded, whether there is time now to revisit the question of who is a refugee and to perhaps widen the definition, because global circumstances have really changed so much, and whether the panel thinks that redefining would actually facilitate their work. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken.
Hi, my name's Tamar. I'm not actually from any organisation, I'm just a citizen. I'm kind of wanting to ask about the UNHCR's thoughts or reflections on the fact that Australia, as a wealthy country in the region, has successively, with different governments, been relying quite heavily on much less wealthy countries in the region, such as Papua New Guinea, looking for solutions to a lot of refugee issues that should be really, I think, our responsibility. And for countries like Papua New Guinea that have a lot of issues themselves for their own citizens with human rights, particularly for women, what the UNHCR kind of thinks about Australia making those decisions, and yeah, what the reflection is, I think, for the agency on what we possibly could be doing as an alternative to that.
Thank you very much. 3 good questions, which could take a long time to answer if we had the time, which unfortunately we don't. So, settlement services, role of the definition in the 51 Convention, who wants to take those 2? And then, I guess, I don't know, Thomas, do you want to deal with the question of transfer of responsibility?
I go for the
No, you go.
All right. Okay, I understood the question to be not just settlement, it was also how to interact with the government, how civil society could engage with the government. Was that the question? Because I think in terms of resettlement, I would certainly, I've said it at the beginning of my intervention. I knew when I was working in Nepal that when the delegations would come and process people to come to Australia, that those were very lucky people, because the services that they were getting upon arrival and so on were understood to be very good. I've seen for myself today how this works, so I actually would say that. When it comes to advocacy, public advocacy and governments, I'm not sure I would know what would be the model. Maybe colleagues here would have views on that. I think there's been in the past in some of the European NGOs who have been quite vocal with governments, but whether they have been able to really change governments, I don't know. I'm looking at there, because I think that was the question, if I understood you.
You said the role of citizens,
the role of
not just NGO and government, role of citizens. I wanted you to elaborate if you can.
Because we had a bit of a discussion today on, sort of how can some of the arguments that are out in the public, how can they be counteracted by the citizens of a country and civil society in a country? What are good models? I think that's what you're basically asking. I don't know, Janet, do you have any?
Yeah. Maybe on the role of civil society. In the international community, we now have a very strong contingent of international NGOs that are very well developed with a lot of resources, a lot of capacity, a lot of experience. But one particular area that really needs, I think, all of our attention is the development of civil society in the less developed countries. Because there's no voice that can be more convincing in their own country than that of the local population. And that will be very good, I think, what we're trying to promote very much in UNHCR is to have this kind of collaboration between international NGOs and the local civil society. When I look around in Asia, decade ago, there were in other parts of Asia other than Australia, the civil society was very quiet and essentially, very much just involved, in non-controversial issues. But I think today, there is a very good beginning. They need to be the watchdog, if you like. And their voices are very, they are the legitimate ones to also raise issue with their own government.
What about the convention definition? Do you want to talk about that?
That's for you.
I'm trying to move away from my former UNHCR role. Well, Ken, I think to revisit the convention in this day and age would be an extremely dangerous thing to do. Even if one was to agree that the convention's not perfect, it is not a text which is likely to survive if it is opened up for renegotiation in what is a very negative climate today. It can be built upon as an instrument. There are ways of building on the convention. You can either build upon it formally and legally through protocols to the convention, for example. You can build upon it in a declaratory sense through United Nations statements and resolutions, etc. You can build upon it through soft law processes such as conclusions of UNHCR's Intergovernmental Executive Committee. But to try and redefine the definition or redefine aspects of the convention, I think would be the death knell of that instrument, and that would be do a serious, serious disservice to the many millions of people who rely upon it actually or in practice around the world today. So it's true that there are aspects of it that need to be rethought, and it's true that it was drafted in an era where refugee status was very individualistic and it was not about large numbers, even though large numbers were on the move, but it was not designed to deal with very large numbers. It's a very inadequate instrument when it comes, for example, to the situation of conditions in refugee camps. But it is a singularly important legal text which should certainly not be opened up in any substantive way for renegotiation of its basics. And I think that has been largely accepted globally, even though there are mumblings from time to time from some governments about the need to put the convention up for reconsideration. So that would be my view on that. Would you like to deal with the question of transfer of responsibility?
Sure, thank you very much. But if I could just add to the issue of the 1951 Convention, in particular the refugee definition, I've heard with quite some interest questions about the relevance of the 1951 Convention at one and the other occasion, and that really made me think about why we have, as an international community, come to the conclusion that we needed such an instrument some 60 years ago. And I think when you look at the history, which is still very, very current and which exactly brings about the same types of persecution, the same type of protection needs today that we could witness during and in the aftermath of the Second World War, I think there is nothing not relevant, on the contrary. And I think we absolutely need to appreciate that this convention and that the refugee definition has served us all globally very, very well. With the other aspect of your question, how do we deal with newer, different types of displacement, persecution, as we have heard in our presentations today, that may be a different question. I don't think we have to replace the foundation to build the first floor of the house. On the contrary, you want to maintain the foundation and then see how best to add to it. On other continents, that has happened. In Africa, you have the OAU Convention, which adds and supplements the provisions of both the refugee definition and other provisions of the 1951 Convention. You have similar type of efforts through the Cartagena Declaration in Latin America and a few other efforts in other parts of the world. There I agree. I think we should spend more effort to see what can we do more and how can we do this in a way that it's really useful for governments, for refugees, for everybody else involved. With regard to the question about offshore processing, as it's sometimes called, clearly, and I think many of you will know, we have very, very serious concerns. Not only with regard to the offshore processing as such, but with what unfortunately today goes along with it, and that is long-term, if not indefinite, detention, the conditions of that. And I would love to go into a little bit of detail to illustrate it more, and I think we probably have to have another event sometime soon, because I think one of the problems we have with all of this is that things have become too short in the explanation. Often a little slogan, a little sentence, and that does not do justice. to very, very complex and serious issues that affect a considerable number of asylum seekers and refugees. But if I can just refer you with regard to the specifics to our website of UNHCR in Australia, where we have, for example, 2 recent reports of monitoring missions to Nauru and to Manus Island, and where I think you see the span of both legal considerations, then issues that relate more to the practicalities, but also a good number of recommendations that we have made to see how we can do better. And I think refugees and everybody else deserves better. And we clearly, as we have seen in the presentations, we need good examples. There are so many issues that relate to the protection of refugees and the imperatives of the protection of refugees globally. And there are so many other good examples in so many countries. The more we can show to others that we are part of the solution, that we are willing to contribute to protection of refugees, the more I think the doors, the arms and the hearts will remain open. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and I'm afraid that's all we have time for now. Thank you all for being such a responsive audience and an attentive audience, and I think a lot of questions have been raised, and I'm sure there will be more in the days and months to come. I can't close without also reminding you what Janet said at the very beginning, and that is that we're very grateful to Melbourne University. We're particularly grateful to the School of Government, and Helen Sullivan is here, and we're also very grateful to the Faculty of Law, and Carolyn Evans is here, just to say thank you very much for having made this possible, and I'm sure UNHCR will get a lot of benefit out of that fact. So, and then finally, thanks to the UNHCR delegation, to my former colleagues, they really are former colleagues, former colleagues and friends, to Janet, to Daisy and Thomas for having given us so much of their time this evening. They have a very hectic schedule, and this is just the beginning of a short but jam-packed mission, so I think we should be very grateful that they have made this time available in Melbourne to us, and we look forward very much to learning of the outcome of their mission as it proceeds. So thank you very much.